I stayed long enough to forget that leaving was ever an option. That's the part people never warn you about. They talk about regret as something loud, something that screams at you in moments of failure. But real regret is quiet. It settles in slowly. It becomes furniture. It becomes routine. One day you wake up and realize your life no longer feels like a decision you're making, but a room you forgot how to exit. If you had asked me years ago whether I was happy, I would have said yes without hesitation. Not because it was true, but because I had learned to answer that question automatically. Happiness became a reflex, not a feeling. I smiled when expected. I nodded when people spoke about the future. I agreed with plans that scared me because disagreement felt more dangerous than fear. I don't remember the exact moment it started. There was no dramatic collapse, no single betrayal, no loud argument that split my life into before and after. That's what makes this harder to explain. My life didn't fall apart. It slowly stopped belonging to me. At some point, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I replaced that question with easier ones. What is expected of me? What keeps things stable? What avoids conflict? Stability became my religion. I worshipped it with sacrifices I didn't realize I was making until years later. Every morning looked the same. Same streets. Same conversations. Same polite laughter that never reached my chest. I became excellent at being reliable. People trusted me. They leaned on me. They praised my consistency. No one noticed that I was disappearing inside that consistency, piece by piece. I told myself this was adulthood. That this dull ache behind my ribs was maturity. That wanting something more was childish, irresponsible, selfish. I watched people chase dreams and secretly judged them, not because I thought they were wrong, but because I was jealous of their courage. It's easier to call someone reckless than to admit you're afraid. There were moments when the mask slipped. Late at night, when the world was quiet and no one needed anything from me, I would feel it. A heavy, suffocating awareness that I was living a life chosen by momentum, not intention. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining alternative versions of myself. Versions that left earlier. Versions that said no. Versions that risked loneliness instead of slow suffocation. But morning always came. And with it, excuses. I stayed because leaving felt cruel. I stayed because people depended on me. I stayed because change would have required explanations I didn't know how to give. Over time, those reasons hardened into walls. The idea of leaving began to feel not just difficult, but immoral. I became an expert at minimizing my own pain. Others had it worse, I told myself. Others suffered real loss. Others faced real tragedy. What right did I have to complain about a life that looked fine from the outside? That logic kept me trapped longer than any external force ever could. Years passed like that. Quietly. Efficiently. I aged without evolving. My reflection changed, but my inner world stayed frozen at the age when I first learned to swallow disappointment instead of expressing it. I stopped dreaming in detail. My dreams became vague concepts like someday and eventually, words that require no action and promise nothing specific. The breaking point didn't come from disaster. It came from boredom. A deep, terrifying boredom that no distraction could silence. I could fill my days with noise, with obligations, with other people's needs, but the silence inside me grew louder. I started to feel like a guest in my own life, carefully not touching anything too important. One evening, I caught myself rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Apologies I would never receive. Explanations I would never give. I realized I was living more vividly in imagined futures and rewritten pasts than in the present moment. That's when the thought first appeared, fully formed and impossible to ignore. If I stay, this is all there will ever be. The thought didn't panic me. That's what scared me most. It felt calm. Rational. almost merciful. I understood then that the danger wasn't losing everything. The danger was losing nothing and calling it a life. That night, I didn't make a plan. I didn't pack a bag or book a ticket. I simply admitted something to myself for the first time. I was not tired because life was hard. I was tired because it wasn't mine. And once you see that truth clearly, you can't unsee it. After that night, something inside me shifted, but nothing on the outside changed. And that was the strangest part. I still woke up at the same hour, answered the same messages, walked the same paths. To everyone else, I was exactly the same person. Responsible. Calm. Present. But internally, a line had been crossed. I was no longer pretending without knowing it. Now I was pretending on purpose. Once you become aware of your own disappearance, every small action feels heavier. Every yes tastes bitter. Every compromise feels like another brick laid over your chest. I began to notice how often I acted automatically, like a well-trained version of myself, responding correctly while my real thoughts stayed hidden, watching from a distance. I started listening to people differently. Not to what they were saying, but to what I felt while they spoke. I noticed how often I felt invisible even when I was needed. How being needed had replaced being known. People knew my function, my reliability, my role. They didn't know my doubts, my resentment, my quiet grief for the life I never lived. There was guilt in that realization. Deep, corrosive guilt. Because no one had forced me into this life. No one had locked a door behind me. I stayed. Again and again. I chose comfort over truth, stability over honesty. Admitting that made me angry at myself in a way I had never allowed before. I tried to fix it the safe way. Small changes. New routines. New habits. I told myself that maybe I didn't need to leave, maybe I just needed to adjust. But those changes felt cosmetic, like rearranging furniture in a burning house. No matter how I moved things around, the air stayed thick, unbreathable. There were days when I felt almost normal again, when the urgency faded and I convinced myself I had exaggerated everything. Those days scared me the most. Because they proved how easily I could slip back into numbness. How adaptable humans are, even to quiet despair. The thought of leaving grew slowly, like something alive. Not dramatic, not impulsive. It became practical. Logical. What would I take, what would I abandon, what would I owe explanations for, and what could I let fade without closure? I hated myself for how relieving those questions felt. At the same time, fear tightened its grip. Not fear of failure, but fear of emptiness. I had built my identity around being dependable, being present, being necessary. Who would I be without that? Who was I when no one expected anything from me? The idea of facing that silence terrified me more than staying ever had. I realized how much of my life was structured around avoiding that question. Noise, obligations, constant availability. As long as someone needed me, I didn't have to confront myself. Leaving meant stripping away all those distractions and standing alone with whatever remained. I began to grieve in advance. For people I would hurt. For versions of myself that would never exist. For the illusion of permanence I had clung to for so long. Grief doesn't always come after loss. Sometimes it comes before, when you understand what a choice will cost you. There was no dramatic goodbye scene forming in my mind. No speeches. No explanations that would make everyone understand. Just distance. Silence. Absence. I knew that disappearing quietly would be seen as cowardice by some. But I also knew that staying out of fear would destroy me completely. One afternoon, I caught my reflection again. This time, I didn't look tired. I looked empty. And that was the moment I understood something fundamental. You can survive many things. You can survive heartbreak, failure, even loss. But surviving a life you never chose slowly erodes your sense of self until survival itself becomes meaningless. I didn't want to wake up at 60 with the same questions echoing unanswered. I didn't want my life to end with a list of reasons instead of experiences. I didn't want to be remembered as reliable if it meant never being real. That night, I finally made the decision. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just clearly. I would leave without trying to be understood. I would accept being misunderstood. I would choose uncertainty over quiet extinction. For the first time in years, I slept without rehearsing tomorrow. I didn't leave in a dramatic way. No packed car at sunrise. No final look back. No letter explaining everything I couldn't say out loud. Real disappearances don't look like movies. They look like ordinary days where one decision quietly changes the direction of a life. I told people I needed space. That I needed time. Both were true, but incomplete. What I didn't say was that I needed to become someone again. Someone undefined. Someone unclaimed. Someone who existed without constant explanation. The first weeks after leaving were not freeing. They were terrifying. Silence followed me everywhere. There was no structure waiting to catch me. No familiar expectations to guide my behavior. I woke up and realized no one knew where I was, what I was doing, or who I was becoming. That realization felt like standing on the edge of something vast and unforgiving. I questioned myself constantly. Had I overreacted? Had I destroyed something valuable in pursuit of a feeling that might never come? Regret didn't disappear when I left. It changed shape. It became sharper, more personal, because now there was no one else to blame. But slowly, something unexpected happened. The noise inside me began to quiet. Not because I was suddenly happy, but because I was finally honest. For the first time in years, my thoughts belonged to me alone. I could follow them without interrupting myself with guilt or obligation. There were lonely nights. Deep ones. Nights when I missed familiarity more than joy. Nights when I almost reached out, not because I wanted to return, but because loneliness makes the past feel softer than it really was. I had to remind myself why I left. Not with anger, but with clarity. I learned that starting over doesn't feel like a rebirth. It feels like being stripped down to something raw and unfinished. There is no applause for choosing yourself. There is no guarantee it will work out. All you gain is responsibility for your own existence. And yet, in that responsibility, I found something I had forgotten how to recognize. Agency. The quiet power of choosing how to spend a morning. The relief of saying no without rehearsing excuses. The strange comfort of not being needed every second. I stopped measuring my worth by usefulness. I stopped apologizing for wanting more than survival. I began asking myself questions again, not to judge the answers, but to hear them. What do I enjoy when no one is watching? What kind of silence feels peaceful instead of heavy? What kind of life would I respect, even if no one else ever noticed it? Some days, I still feel the weight of what I left behind. Leaving doesn't erase attachment. It just changes its distance. I carry that weight with me, not as punishment, but as proof that my choices mattered. That I mattered. I don't pretend this path is noble. It isn't clean or heroic. It's messy and uncertain and often uncomfortable. But it is real. And after years of quiet self-betrayal, real feels like enough. If you're listening to this and feel something tightening in your chest, something familiar, I want to tell you to leave. That choice belongs only to you. But I will say this. Staying can be just as dangerous as leaving, especially when you stay long enough to forget who you are. You don't owe your entire life to decisions made by a version of yourself who didn't know better. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to disappoint people. You're allowed to choose a future that doesn't make sense to anyone else. I stayed until I forgot who I was. I left before I forgot that I mattered. And that, finally, feels like the beginning of a life I can stand behind.